So, sorry for getting off for a late start, and I hope it doesn't inconvenience anyone. I know everyone's time is precious. So, today we're going to talk about Gamla from a little different perspective than we usually do. We will give Gamla its due later on. And I wanted to specifically talk not so much about how the people of Gamla died, but perhaps about how they lived, and tell you a little story of something that happened this past week that brought me to think about this. Sometimes I feel that people have an obsession with death. We all know that it's going to come at some point. It can be very scary, but we often get preoccupied with death. Even when touring, even when hiking, people will often say when we go to a certain site, "So tell us how they died," or "How many people died here?" So last week I was with a guides course for 3 days in the north, one in the Upper Galilee, the other on Mount Hermon, and the other in the Golan. On the first day we went to Nebi Yusha, or Mitzudat Koach, the famous fort we talked about just about a month ago here on our Sunday nights, called the Fort of the 28, because 28 soldiers died there. So do guides have to really know that number? Yes, they actually do. There may be a question on the test about it, and that's what the course is also about. But it's also about how to guide. I told them, well, 28 people died here, and I see they all wrote that in their notebooks and their iPads, 28. And again, there were 3 attacks, 4 people died in the first attack, 22 people died in the second attack, 2 in the third, and they all wrote this down. But I wondered if they would remember the life stories of the people who died there while they were alive. And this is kind of like a graphic way of explaining it. We can focus on tombstones, and we can still focus on live people. And I know that the history here is a little bit of both, but sometimes it's very overwhelming. So here's the fort up on top. But I also told them the story of Dudu down here on the bottom left, the famous commander mentioned in a famous 1948 Israeli song about he got really emotional one night, and the soldiers kind of made fun of him because he was crying while he was carrying a little boy who came from Europe to Israel against British law and was swimming to safety from his boat to the shore in the Mediterranean. Or about this young man, Yizhar, on the right, who for his bar mitzvah composed an original tune for verses from his Haftarah, from his Haftorah. He was in the scouts in a tribe called Masada, and he worked on a kibbutz in the fish ponds. When I told them that story, nobody wrote it down. After that, we moved on to Tel Chai, another place where a lot of people died. One of the most famous, maybe the most iconic battle in modern Jewish history. So, of course, 2 died before the big battle, 6 died during the big battle, and that's why they named the nearby city Kiryat Shmona, the city of the 8. And again, of course, it was numbers. But would they remember the story of Dvorah, who elbowed her way into the male-dominated Hashomer movement and went on a secret mission to Damascus and was one of the instigators of the Hashomer women's strike for equality. And yet, despite the strike, showed up for guard duty on that fateful day. The next day we went to Mount Hermon. There's still some snow there nearby. And we saw butterflies and raptors and plants that were still blooming in July. And then we came to the Battle Hills because, according to the Ministry of Tourism, you have to get to the battlefields. It really is an important place where the IDF Golani Brigade fought fiercely during the 1973 Yom Kippur War in order to get back that important peak from the Syrian army. We were close to the highest peak in Israel, an incredible view of the entire north. I tried to summarize what happened here almost 50 years ago, which is pretty much an impossible task. But I did what I could. I brought with me the books that told the story best, and I took them out of my backpack and I showed it to them. And I said, you can't really seriously guide here without either reading these books or talking to people who actually fought here. And when I finished, I was asked, can you repeat how many people fell in each attack? And I took a deep breath and asked myself, why does everybody ask me this? And what are they going to do with this information? But it was a legitimate question, and it was my job to answer. Yes, in the first attack, 16 soldiers died. In the second attack, Golani lost 25 men. And in the third attack, 55 soldiers from Golani died. And everybody wrote this down and did their computing. But I couldn't just finish there. And I told the story of Benny, a young man who had a criminal record. He came from a really tough neighborhood and yet was an outstanding soldier in the battle, but few people wrote that down. And the third day, we were at Tel Saki, who we just talked about a few Sundays ago. We highlighted that, and of course, this time I was asked a different question. Someone said, I'm confused. Was it 32 people who died and they had to be in the bunker for 30 hours? Or was it 30 who died and they waited for 32 hours? And of course, I appreciated the fact that they wanted to get their facts straight and they wanted to pass the test and they wanted to be precise when passing on the story. But the question is, will they be able to transcend the numbers and touch on the lives of the people who fought here? At Masada, that's perhaps the classic place. Everybody goes there. Everybody wants to know details about the suicide. So how did they die? So how many people died? And did everyone kill themselves, or did they have a system where they were killed? And where did they die? And did they ever find the bodies? And there was one man named Yoshua Cohen, who in the 1970s and the 80s established a number of institutions that would teach Jewish values in the great outdoors of Israel. And these were called field schools. And they still exist and thrive in Israel today. And there's people here with us who worked at them. One he started in Sde Care in the south, and one he started in Kfar Etzion. And Yoshua believed and taught the idea of meta-history, connecting events throughout thousands of years of Jewish history and seeing how each event had a conversation with another event and how they influenced each other. This man was an artist in connecting the dots, as he is quoted here. The ghetto fighters in Europe in the Holocaust drew their brave spirit from the heroes of Masada. This is a fact. And we here, he's talking about himself as one of the fighters in the IDF, in pre-IDF, drew our strength from the trapped ghetto fighters. This is the historical continuum, and there's nothing like it. And I am only the shamash candle that comes to light the torch for the heroes of Israel throughout the generations. And he was also Ben Gurion's personal bodyguard, but more than that, he was an educator and a visionary who taught generations of people how to teach. And he's sorely missed. So he, just in his example, he went to dig with Yadin in Masada in the 1960s, not so much to study archaeology, but to try to feel the spirit of the Jews who lived and died at Masada. And one of his main messages to guides at Masada was, yes, we need to mention the deaths of the Jews of Masada, but shouldn't we really focus on how they lived? And so we come to Gamla. Everybody on the note has been there practically, and most people have hiked up to the very, very top of that Camelback mountain, very similar to a mountain in Arizona that I've heard about called Camelback. That's Gamla, the capital of the Golan, the capital of the southern Golan, excavated by Shmaria Gutman, who we recently highlighted here. And we discussed the lintel stone that he discovered at Dapura. The same Gamla whose synagogue, founded in the 1970s, was considered at the time the most ancient in all of Israel. And here, of course, we have to quote Ifat, the famous Livno teacher, who said, yes, this used to be the oldest synagogue in Israel until they went and they built older ones. A classic Ifat joke. This is the same Gamla that some have called erroneously, in many people's opinion, including Shmarya's, the Masada of the North. Historically, all we really have is Josephus Flavius, Yosef ben Matityahu, who is our only written source on the final battle of so many sites. And might we claim that Josephus himself had a bit of an obsession with not only death, but suicide? Let's see, Arbel, Yodfat, Gamla, Masada, all ended with mass suicides according to Josephus. But it's already been shown by archaeologist Hillel Geva a few years ago that the Romans had to construct a second ramp at Masada when they reached the top of the mountain in order to overcome Jews that were still holding out in the old northern palace. Shmaryahu himself wrote that Josephus's description of the 5,000 suicide jumpers from the peak of Masada is simply not realistic after he visited the peak on his own. And he believed that this was tainted history telling that was politically motivated. Josephus was in debt to the Roman emperors who saved his life, brought him to Italy, gave him Roman citizenship, a Roman estate, a Roman wife, and paid him to write the history of the Great Revolt, known as the Wars of the Jews. Instead, wrote Shmarya, it seems to him that the citizens of Gamla, well, some were murdered by the Romans, some died fighting, maybe some committed suicide, but perhaps many actually managed to escape to the west towards the Galilee, and it just wasn't cool to write about it. So for the next coming minutes, with your permission, I'd like to adopt Yoshua Cohen's approach to Masada and apply it to Gamla. Instead of focusing on how they died, let's see how they lived. And I specifically chose things that had absolutely nothing to do with the famous battle that ended the history of Gamla in the year 67 of the Common Era. That we shall discuss at a later date. So if we're talking about the living, let's talk about making a living. How did people make a living at Gamla? So almost everyone, according to the archaeologists, were either farmers or agribusiness owners. Shmarya noted that due to the enormous amounts of certain animal bones found at Gamla, there were a significant amount of herdsmen with flocks of sheep and goats and cattle up on the plateau above the city. Now this is interesting because in yesterday's Torah portion, we hear of a request by some of the tribes to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan River because of the excellent grazing lands that it offered their flocks. And actually still today, there's a few cattle still grazing there. Many others dealt with olive oil. A large amount of the people of Gamla apparently grew olives and made olive oil and sold it. The location of Gamla on the edge of the southern Golan Heights and close to an ancient road was perfect for two things, growing olives and selling it, both to the east, Syria and Babylonia. Perhaps Jewish communities are there who wanted special kind of kosher olive oil, and to the west, the international port city of Tyre in Lebanon. And this is due to the many, many coins from Tyre that were found at Gamla. We know about this specific profession because 4 industrial-sized olive presses were uncovered at Gamla. We have olive presses in Gamla from the Hasmonean period, which is about 100 years before the Common Era. And we have olive presses from the early Roman period, which is about 100 years after the Common Era, or in the first half of the 1st century. There's also evidence of a few other professions in Gamla. There were potters in Gamla, although a few pieces of Gamla's earthenware were imported from Spain and Turkey. Only the wealthy could really afford those. And some of the pottery was produced in the Galilee. A large amount of pottery originated in Gamla itself. They're able to tell that even back in the 70s and 80s. But the local potter's factory has yet to be discovered. Actually, only about 12 to 15% of Gamla has actually been excavated. So we know actually very little. So if we've already found 4 huge olive presses, that means this was a serious occupation. Among some of the other things they found were a grape harvester's blade, which kind of reminds us of all the wine that's being grown today in the Golan Heights, very close to Gamla. There was also a plow, so people grew grains, and spurs for horseback riding. That's going to be a guess what that was for. Apparently, for some people who were high up in the Hasmonean administration who used horses kind of like as one would use maybe a Porsche for status, because Gamla isn't really suitable for horses. There's also some luxury items that they found in Gamla. For instance, in the wealthy neighborhood on the western side of Gamla, they found some very fancy buildings and gold jewelry. 3 earrings and 1 pendant, all made of solid gold, and rings and earrings made from pearls and glass and stones. And they found a signet ring with some very delicate engraving. One was of a lion pouncing on a gazelle, which people would kind of mush into the hot wax. It wasn't wax back then, but rather it was a kind of a clay. And there was another one you can see here on the right with clusters of grapes. Maybe that was their family seal, because maybe they were the people who were growing grapes. And just in case they wanted to prove to us that the wealthy residents had a leisure time to spare, there were also playing boards made from bone, as well as 3 playing dice. If you can imagine blackjack in the Golan 2,000 years ago, you never know. But I'd specifically like to focus on Jewish life. This is a very strange picture. What do we see here? What we're actually looking at is an alleyway. And somebody put rocks to block the alleyway and make it smaller than it already is, and it's already small. So exactly 1900 years passed between the time the last Jewish resident lived in Gamla, the big war was in 67, and the first modern Jew discovered the site in 1967. That's kind of easy to remember. But here there's no dry desert climate that can preserve things like ancient scrolls that you could find in the Judean desert. So what are the chances of finding something Jewish here? You have to be a little creative, and Shmaria had that. So how on earth can an archaeologist know, for instance, if people who lived at a certain site observed Shabbat? How is that possible? If you're going to find challah, it's not going to, that's just, no. Shmaria could. And he didn't find candlesticks or ancient gefilte fish or those little Shabbat newsletters that get circulated around your local shul. It's also important to remember he didn't lead a classic halachic life. He was a founder and member of Kibbutz Na'an, which, to put it lightly, did not encourage a halachic life. But Shmaria himself had a very Jewish soul. He knew Jewish laws and traditions and sources like the back of his hand, even more than people who do actually live a halachic life. So in one of the residential areas in Gamla, right here, he found a narrow alleyway that was only 1 meter wide. You can't really walk in there with anything in your hands, or 2 people can just barely pass. at the two entrances to the alleyway, there's an additional wall built to make it even lower, and that to make it even narrower, and that you can see here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. And at the other end of the alley, the same thing exists. Now, why would anybody do that? It's impractical and it's inconvenient. But Shmarya had a hunch that the only reason someone would do this would have to do somehow with Jewish law, with halakha. And he came up with the idea that these must be known as cheeks, lechayim. Okay, so in the Jewish law, you can actually, by adding these additions to an entrance, whether it be an alleyway or something that looks like an entrance, you can actually halakhically turn public property where you can't carry things on Shabbat into private property where you can. So on Shabbat, if people wanted to carry, this would be able to make the change by putting these sides, these cheeks of stones on both sides of the alleyway. There's no other reason why someone would do it. So this was kind of an eruv. It would make carrying permissible. Now, how many of us, if we were excavating, would have realized that? We would have looked at this and said, I don't know, they wanted to balance something or whatever. Even those of us who are Shabbat observers, it just doesn't stick out. But Shmarya could, because Shmarya had Jewish eyes. Right underneath the synagogue building, Shmarya found another alleyway that constituted something called a mavoy, mentioned in the Talmud as another way to allow carrying on Shabbat. And he explained in great detail how this could work. I'm not going to go into the halachic details of the subject, mainly because I don't understand it myself. But Shmarya swam skillfully through this sea of halakha. I'm sure there are people here who can help us understand this idea of the mavoy, but also we're talking about an alleyway that looked very strange. It was between the synagogue and a residential area, and by having two entrances by an entrance on each side, they'd actually again turned public property into private property. And now we come to the two classic institutions that will exist in almost any Jewish city that are usually visible even long after a city has been destroyed. And we're specifically talking about a mikvah and a synagogue. So let's take a look at this. Here's a classic mikvah. Shmarya uncovered 4 mikvahs in Gamla. One is adjacent to the synagogue, which is fascinating in itself. One is in a house from the Hasmonean period, like this one. It has 8 steps, and here towards the bottom, although you can't see it, it had a little railing, which was very rare back then, that would allow, it wasn't a railing that separated the people going in and out, it was a railing that allowed people not to fall headfirst into the mikvah because the stairs are so steep here. Something that's kind of rare. Also, the shape was kind of interesting. So 4 different ones that said, one next to the synagogue, one in the Hasmonean period house, one in an early Roman period house, and one in the middle of an industrial olive press. It turns out that this is one of many mikvahs that have been found in Israel in industrial areas dealing with the production, specifically of wine and olive oil. By dipping in the mikvah and following the rules of ritual purity, known in the Jewish sources as tahara, the wine and olive oil would have a special status. For instance, it could be used in the temple in Jerusalem, or it could be used in the homes of people who had a tradition of eating food prepared in the status of tahara. These mitzvot are not kept today, thousands of years after the destruction of the temple and long after people ate food according to tahara. Since Gamla was relatively far from Jerusalem, the locally produced olive oil was probably sold to those, perhaps in Syria and Babylonia, who kept the laws of Tahara. That's a possibility. So the idea of the mikveh, that's going to show that these people cared about Tahara. And if we move on, the famous synagogue, one of the biggest synagogues that we know of, and the only one in the Golan from the time of the temple. This was built on a steep slope, and the archaeologists note, if you notice here, there's a steep slope afterwards. You can't even see what's underneath the synagogue because the slope goes all the way down to the riverbed that you can see there. And this made the construction very expensive. And there's a number of rows of benches that you can see that surround the building, except for a small area here where the benches are a little different and the top bench doesn't exist. So some believe that perhaps this is where the Torah was read or the prayer leader stood. It's commonly believed that synagogues that existed at the time of the temple didn't face Jerusalem. And in the case of Gamla, it wasn't really possible anyway, because the direction of Jerusalem was the direction of the slope. And that would mean we'd have to turn this, the orientation of this building is east-west. If we were to turn it 90 degrees, it would be way out hanging in the air. So it had to be built perpendicular to the slope, with the entrance on the right here, very close actually to the mikvah. In addition to its age, there were two additional unique aspects of this synagogue. One was its proximity to the wall. You see these two folks here on the left. This person wearing a red shirt is actually on the wall of the city. So you can see that the synagogue is extremely close to the wall. There's just a little room here, which we'll mention in a moment, that separates the two. And one of the entrances to town was right here. And this reminds us of the tradition since the days of Ezra the scribe, to read the Torah on Monday and Thursday, which were market days in Israel's ancient cities. One can imagine, here's a picture of in the market, in the shuk, there's a synagogue. You can imagine people streaming in from the many little villages in the southern Golan, listening to the Torah reading at Gamla's very conveniently located synagogue, and then stepping outside the walls or maybe inside the walls at a different location, doing some shopping before returning home to eat whatever they bought. And it should be noted that synagogues, at least during the Hasmonean period, and the few that have been found, as noted here in this inscription, kind of a famous inscription, the Theodotus inscription, found in a cistern in the city of David in Jerusalem. It says here in Greek that this synagogue specifically, they believe synagogues at the time, were not used for prayer, not for communal prayer. Please don't be shocked. It's okay. There's many people still who go to the synagogue today and do not pray. However, that was a joke. It was used for the following, kind of like a community center for listening to the Torah reading, communal Torah learning. Like there's a difference between hearing the Torah being read and learning the Torah. Like, for instance, a sermon or a talk on the Torah and how it can be relevant to today, back then. It also served as a place for visitors to sleep if they didn't have another place, and to use the water installations, which we understand could be drinking or actually using the mikvah, which was right there at the entrance to the synagogue. So the very location of the synagogue at the entrance to Gamla and the wall allows us to imagine what daily life must have been like over 2,000 years ago. And here is, at the menorah near the Knesset, a graphic description of Ezra the scribe trying to read to the people from the Torah. Another fascinating discovery at the eastern edge of the synagogue was the special room that I just mentioned, where those two people were standing, and this is it. This is one of the most fascinating discoveries at Gamla. So this is a separate yet connected by a window that they found, not the glass, but the area where the window was, that separated the synagogue from the city wall. This room is only 2.5 by 3.5 meters. It had benches also, as you can see here, 2 on the left, 1 on the right, and a window that looked straight into the synagogue. The excavators guessed that it could seat about 25 people and came to the conclusion that this was a Bet Midrash. This was a study room for studying the Torah, just that we talked about a couple weeks ago about Dabura, where they found, Shmaria himself, found the lintel stone that said, this is the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar. So here they actually found the building, they believe, that was the Bet Midrash of Gamla. And it was right next to the synagogue with a window looking through, so that, let's say, if there were going to be something happening there, let's say the reading of the Torah for the entire congregation, they would be able to know and leave this room and go into the synagogue and join the rest of the people in the synagogue. And there are places today, synagogues today, where you can actually find a Bet Midrash right next to the main sanctuary. For instance, here, even though they're praying here, this is actually a Bet Midrash. You can see the books. And over through this little door that has window doors, you can see the actual sanctuary with the Arona Kodesh. So many synagogues and Bet Midrash, Batei Midrash, are actually connected still today. It makes a lot of sense. But that, of course, this fits the Theodotus inscription like a glove. And it's also a key to understanding the multitasking nature of ancient synagogue complexes. You could say it's kind of like a JCC today, but with a more, perhaps, spiritual nature. So in a fascinating book written about the Golan, written by the beloved former rabbi of my Moshav, still writing books today, Rav Yigal Ariel, he connects this room with a Talmudic tradition about the origin of grade schools in ancient Israel. The Talmud mentions a very controversial man known as Yehoshua ben Gamla, the same name as a person who became the high priest in the temple. And in the tractate of Baba Batra, it is written, and I'm not quoting but paraphrasing, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, and yet we remember this man for good, and Yehoshua ben Gamla was his name, for without him, the Torah would have become forgotten in Israel. In the beginning, if one had a father, he would teach you the Torah, but if you had no father, you would not learn Torah, until Yehoshua ben Gamla came and made the following change. In every area and in every city, they would have teachers to teach the children from the age of 6 or 7. That's the quote. It's fascinating. As it were, in ancient times, kids didn't go to school at that age. Most probably worked, I'm guessing. If they happen to be from wealthy families, maybe they played with the dice or just had fun, or had private tutors. And one man, perhaps, changed it all. And for those who know, in Florida, there's an English Hebrew charter school with a number of campuses around the Hollywood, Miami area. And they called it the Ben Gamla Charter School. It's open actually to anyone who wants to join, Jewish or not. So the name Yehoshua ben Gamla, the odds of Yehoshua's father being called Camel are probably slim. There's a good chance that the Gamla of Ben Gamla refers actually to his hometown. like Bar Kokhba's suggested original name was probably Bar Koziva, which may refer to his hometown of Ksiv or Koziva, and there are places like that in Israel. And if this is true, there's a chance that we're looking here at one of the first grade schools ever found in ancient Israel. But even if this was not the case, the fact that a small room for sitting was adjacent to a large synagogue, which is almost exactly like the architecture of many modern synagogues today, is very interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon. And a similar setup was recently found at the ancient site of Migdal on the shores of Lake Kinneret, also from the time of the temple, the synagogue and the Bet Midrash right next to each other. But if this hypothesis just happens to be true, then Gamla, in Jewish eyes, is an earth-shattering, trailblazing town. Think of this. Gamla may have been the very site that inspired the idea of primary education. And that is a pretty powerful idea. So I decided not to focus tonight on the final battle of Gamla. We'll deal with that in a later session. And I'm not denying its importance, nor do I think it detracts in any way from the great stature of the inspiring last stand of the brave people of Gamla. I just wanted really to make a point. And I've heard that many guides who take groups to Europe to learn about the Shoah also make this point. We need to learn the details of their deaths, to learn how they died, and to be inspired by their stories, but no less important is how they lived. When our great-great-grandchildren will want to learn about us, do we want them to remember our deaths? No, we want them to remember our lives. And in that case, let's pay it backwards. Thank you for your time, and I again want to apologize for the late start. If anybody has any comments, feel free.
Michael, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Can you see it?
Oh yeah, a lot of them.
Okay. I think the first questions are, how do you know Monday and Thursday were market days in ancient Israel? From Ellen.
I believe it is in the ancient Jewish texts. I do not have that text in front of me. I'm sorry, but I will look that up. Akiva is reminding us, he knew Yoshua personally, of Yoshua Cohen's fascinating story. He was in a very controversial anti-British group that that did some very controversial things before 1948. And one moment, he afterwards moved to the Negev and decided to become an educator while also being Ben Gurion's not just bodyguard but confidant. And they became very good friends. So yes, that I wanted to. That is a story in itself, really. Yoshua Cohen is an entire class in itself. I think, Akiva, you're probably the only one here who actually met him, although I was influenced by him, but totally indirectly. So Lisa is mentioning something interesting, that there is a theory that the reason I didn't talk about the battle, but during the one of the first stages of the battle, the Romans broke through the gates of Gamla. After, not the gates of Gamla, they broke down the wall with the battering rams, ran in, and then the Jews turned around, and there was a traffic jam of Romans on the rooftops, and there was so much weight that the roofs fell in. And there is a theory that it was Sukkot, and that the Romans actually thought they fell through the schach of Sukkot. Now, I've heard that as a theory, but that would, in my opinion, which is totally not scientific here, it kind of makes the Romans look kind of stupid, because you could probably tell if there was schach or not. I mean, I wouldn't, but it is a theory because it actually did happen on Sukkot. So that is an interesting theory. I just don't see it happening in real life. So yes, so that Yuda's question about it possibly was a women's section is a possibility, but we actually, the only time, this is a big discussion among archaeologists, which I believe many of the archaeologists make it a very political thing. So people, for instance, who believe that a mechitza is a very negative thing and is anti-feminist will often claim that there was no mechitza. And people who believe that the mechitza is very important today in Jewish life in order to allow men and women to concentrate will often argue that there were mechitzas. And it's almost humorous, but like it's very hard. Archaeologists in Israel become very, very involved and things become very, very political. Even how people understand Masada, right, has become very, very political. I hear it all the time when I try to listen to other guides, and it's fine to bring yourself into the conversation and give your opinion, but often it kind of goes on this political direction. There is a Leave Note story that has to do with this, and my friend, the archaeologist here in Nov, asked me if we could, she must have been 15 years ago, if a Leave Note group would like to dig in one of the synagogues in the Golan. He said it was the last day of the dig of that year. And there's this tradition that on the last day of the dig, the excavators find the most fascinating things. And also he wanted funding for the next year. So he decided the best way to get funding is this theory of his. He thought that there was actually an outside staircase outside of the synagogue that went up to the second floor. This is from the Byzantine period, not the Hasmonean period, okay? So it wouldn't fit Gamla, but he said, let's dig here. So we came there, a Leave Note group came there, and we dug for an entire, I think, half a day, 5 hours. Somebody found a coin, and we actually found the staircase itself, which you could easily see started outside the synagogue and went up to the second floor, in which case he thought this would be a good this would give backing to the idea that instead of a mechitza, the second floor was used by women and therefore the entrance would be outside. Of course, this is only a theory and it's only been found there. But this was actually a totally different room, and I had never heard that theory, but it's always possible. And the truth is we have no proof that it's a Bet Midrash. It just fits. I think people looked at this building and saw the modern way that synagogues and Batei Midrash are built, and that's how they came to the conclusion. Victor writes, Monday and Thursday were market days according to the Mishnah, and you can see that in Masechet Megillah. Todah, Victor. We'll have to look that up, and that answers the question that was put out by Ellen. So thank you for asking and answering. And today we don't really have those market days, but you know, still Sunday we're still eating. I don't know about you guys, but Sunday we're still eating the leftovers for Shabbat, and by that time, you know, Monday it's like there's nothing in the fridge. You gotta go to the store, and of course you gotta get ready. You're not gonna go with the Friday rush, so Thursday it just makes sense. So that perhaps the location of the synagogue there, it kind of helps us kind of, if you have creative eyesight and you can reconstruct ancient sites, you can kind of bring Gamma to life, and it allows us to do that. So once things open up here again, hopefully people will be able to get the Gamma. And I do promise Bli Neder that because a number of people asked, that we will take care of the more classic story of Gamma, which is how it became to be destroyed, since it is, after all, a big issue. But I think we were kind of giving homage to Yoshua Cohen and his idea of focusing on life at Gamla. Toda rabah. And
Michael.